Okay. So we're going to go back now to Board of Governors discussion and action to adopt responses to question 3. And I was going to turn this over to Executive Director Nevitt to kind of outline what she's put in the materials for us.
Okay. And I also want to start with an apology that, it really came to a time crunch at the end. So I'm sorry that you all didn't get more time to review all these materials. At the last meeting, at the end of the meeting, I had asked for input from the board as to what you would like to see in terms of potential scenarios. And although there was not one board directive based on the input from board members who spoke up, we prepared 3 proposals with legal analysis and fiscal analysis. So the 3 proposals are, the first one is essentially the status quo or do nothing proposal. Although I'll note that at the end, there are also some additional suggestions, even if the board were to go with the status quo. Proposal number 2 is to create a separate legislative entity. And proposal number 3 is to bifurcate the organization with the regulatory functions moving under the Supreme Court. You will also, for proposal number 3, you will find materials from Governor Abell and Governor Higginson. Governor Couch and Boyd have also volunteered to be spokespeople for proposal number 1. And of course, proposal number 2 was originally proposed by Governor Williams-Ruth. A few other things in the materials that you may find helpful. Also at the last meeting, there was a request from a governor that it might be useful to have a list of all of the Bar Association's functions. I did attempt to do that. I don't know how helpful it will be. There's just so many, and it's really hard to know how to slice and dice them. You could do it in a lot of different ways, but that is in there in case you find it helpful. You also have the results of the employee survey where we sought feedback about the question as to whether to bifurcate. And then you also have the results of the member survey regarding the same questions, as well as the additional member comments that we've received since the last meeting. And so I might suggest maybe having each of the proposals presented by the spokespeople and maybe go from there.
Okay, so Governor Pertzer has his hand up.
I wanted just to pose this question maybe before the proposals, just as an idea. After reviewing all these things, and it appears on the membership survey that still the majority of the members want to keep the unified bar. In a couple of observations, we didn't get very many responses from the survey, out of the membership. So that's the first thing to consider. The next is that we're trying to, I think, collectively improve the participation by the general membership into the bar to get more folks involved. And if I'm understanding, and I think it's Governor Abell's proposal, the additional cost associated with a bifurcated bar and being the voluntary bar, the mandatory bar. I guess a question I have is, right now, as it stands, it appears to me that we're not in any legal jeopardy. I totally understand that could change, but I honestly don't think that if there's a change to be made, it's going to be as quick as I think that perhaps we might have understood before. So with that said, if in fact the goal is to increase membership as opposed to decrease membership, and I'd like to have this maybe discussed of the 3 proposals, how is it that each of the proposals will address the considerations of maintaining or increasing membership participation, keeping cost at keeping the cost associated with reasonable in the circumstance. I'm having a difficult time, frankly, and from my humble opinion, understanding how bifurcating the bar benefits the bar at this point in time, when we're going the opposite direction of if we do so, increases the cost, and there's frankly the likelihood of getting less participation. So that's just a question generally put out there. And so if all the proposals could address that, that'd be something I'd like to hear. So thank you very much.
Well, shall we start with, anybody else have any preliminary thoughts or questions? Should we go ahead and start with Jordan Couch and Lauren Boyd, the proponents of sort of status quo, to make a presentation? Excuse me.
I'm happy to get us started here. And I think
Thank you.
because Lauren had to call in, I'm going to take the lead on this a little bit, and I'm going to have a drink so I don't cough through the entire thing. All right. So we had this in the materials here. We have some great materials on this, but I'm going to kind of go over those in an overview and then address some of the questions that I've seen come up since then. So what this would be is maintaining our current structure, right? This whole process began with the question of, there are these pending court cases and we want to be prepared. We've already answered the question that addresses that. These pending court cases are no longer pending. We are not under threat. That part is done. Now, there may be future court cases in the later times, but those ones that we were concerned about, we already decided do not require any change. So the purpose of beginning this conversation, in a large part, has been addressed. The reality is that this is a privilege we have to be a self-regulated profession and to work together to do this. We have a unique opportunity to have a strong group of people. And this is the most effective way to promote the mission. When we have everyone working together to support lawyers, to support the public, when we bring lawyers together around that idea on both supporting themselves and supporting the public, having these things be one and the same makes us stronger because we can do all the things with a full bar association. We have all of these services, and I can't go through the entire list, but these services exist and are strengthened by each other. We have the ethics line that is strengthened by sections who can recommend people to the ethics line. We have all of our DEI initiatives that cross paths between the things the sections do when they put on CLEs and the things that the regulatory bar does by mandating these. Each of these are stronger by working together in these various groups. And speaking of the sections, you know, one thing we talked about is in past versions of this conversation was what the sections wanted. And that was the initiating point for what happened in California. And that was what initiated this conversation back in 2017 when we had it before. And overwhelmingly, the sections have spoken to us and made it clear that what they want is to remain as they are as a unified bar, because they also see that they are stronger by having all of us together in this system. It also takes the most efficient use of our resources, right? The fiscal analysis of this shows that bifurcating the bar will be substantially more expensive, will require more cost allocation, and will be a more complex system for everyone involved. It's not as effective in being responsible with how we spend the money and how we're getting the members' money. This also, I think, you know, there's a good point here about it protecting the rule of law, and the judicial branch as an independent organization. This is something that we have in a unified bar where we are under the judicial branch. We are a part of a branch of the government under the Constitution of Washington of the United States. And bifurcating that, taking us into separate processes, breaks away a piece of what we are as a profession, as a member of this branch, and puts us into another section. Going on to this, let's see. So I wanted to address, you know, and without going into the materials that we had in detail, I wanted to kind of address some of the things that have come up before this. So the member surveys, I think, were really, really fascinating to me. One, you know, I know we didn't get a lot of responses on this, but I was happy to see that the company we hired to do this was 98% confident almost in their results, being an accurate prediction of what the entire bar would say. If we were to go out and poll every single individual member of the Washington State Bar, I think that's really telling. And I know that oftentimes people say, well, I wish we had more, you know, otherwise it's just a data point. It's not really asking everyone. But whenever I hear those kinds of things, I think to myself about how most of science happens. For those who've studied, you know, the history of Western science, it's all probability. The way we know the structure of the atom is not because we could see it. It's because we fired electrons at this thing and saw that the way that it bounced. And probabilistically, the way that it bounced required us to imagine a model of the atom. We've never seen what an atom looks like, but we use probability based on tests like this. So when we see, you know, yes, we didn't ask every member, but we saw enough that this company was 98% sure. And in that survey, status quo won by nearly a 20% margin. I think that's really key here. And what I thought was even most remarkable about this is that in the materials, you see that there was a second survey done, written with completely different questions. I believe those were the questions written by Governor Higginson, and it was shared with the elder law section. And even though they were completely different questions, a completely different preamble, shared with an individual section, that survey had almost identical results, but with an even stronger lean in favor of the status quo, which I think makes sense because it was among the section that did that. But that tells me just how accurate this was and how deeply rooted it is that our members want the status quo. Because both in the professionally done survey and in the ad hoc survey with different questions, we got the same results. That's telling in a scientific way of what our members want and how accurate and good this survey was. What we have right now is what the members want. And that's without us even telling them that bifurcation would increase their dues by over 40% based on the projections we saw. So the thing I like to think about too, as we're talking about this, is what is the measure of success? How do we define success? And for those who are thinking that bifurcation might be the answer, I would ask you to think, what is the metric by which you will measure success? If we decide to bifurcate today, in 5 years, when you look at the data, when you look at the information, how are you going to decide whether this was a success or not? Because the data we have right now seems to indicate that, sorry, I just got a message from, seems to indicate that the members, that all the data have that status quo is the best thing for this bar. All the data we have, which isn't a ton, indicates that member engagement will decrease. And this is addressing what Governor Pertzer brought up earlier. California, even though they offered free membership to people in the beginning, lost over 10,000 members in the first few years, despite that free membership. They saw a decrease in engagement. So what's the next measure? You can say, well, you say we measure it by having fewer complaints about bar activities. But here's the thing by that, and Director Platchett can confirm this for me. The complaints we get as a bar are not about section activity. They are about the undeniably germane activity we do around DEI. The CLE is about implicit bias. The inclusivity programs that we have, those are what we get complaints about, not section activities. And if you look at the member survey, the things people are talking about that they don't like the bar does, it's those things that are undeniably germane and essential. So I would actually argue that if we get fewer complaints after bifurcating, what we're going to see is that that's a problem. That means these voluntary bar associations aren't doing their job because they have to cater to everyone, to get voluntary members to join them. So they can't do the things that might make members unhappy. But voluntary section has to cater to its members. A unified bar like we are right now has the freedom and opportunity to lead. We can tell members what they need to say. We can mandate ethics credits. We can have DEI CLEs. We can have DEI programs because we know they're essential. And we can enforce those. And that's what members complain about. We're not going to see a lack of member complaints. So what about cost savings, right? We saw the metrics on that, and costs, this proposal will increase dues by over 40% without offering any more services to our members. It's not helping on that front. So then the next metric I could think of is talking about, serving the members' wishes, serving the members' goals. In that sense, the members have spoken and they don't seem to want bifurcation. They want the status quo to remain the same. And so really the only metric I can think we can talk about that we can maybe look at as a success is, well, what if we just avoid being forced to bifurcate in the future, or avoid getting sued in the future and having to deal with that front? The reality is bifurcation isn't going to protect us from this, because the things people have problems with are not the things that our sections are doing. It's the DEI work that we believe is essential that we would continue doing. We don't make ourselves judgment proof by bifurcating now. These are lawyers who have problems. They will find reasons to sue. They will be upset about it. I think the fear of litigation is not the right way to make a decision on this. And the truth is, we don't know what's going to happen if we bifurcate, whether we'll see fewer lawsuits or not. So think to yourself is, what is the metric you're going to use to measure success? And the status quo, we know what that measure is. We know that most of the metrics we have indicate that status quo is the way to improve our profession, to keep us strong, to serve the members, and to serve the public. And I'm more than happy to answer questions about any of this if people want, but I'm going to end myself there.
Anybody have any questions for Governor Couch and Governor Boyd if she's available?
I see Governor Boyd has her hand up.
She does, but Governor Bell has his first.
I'll defer to Governor Boyd. Thank you, Mr. President.
Governor Boyd.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to add what Governor Couch said so well. I think Governor Couch is talking a lot about the practical aspects of the fact that the WSBA is a business and the practice of law is a business. And I think those are all very good things to consider. I think they're maybe the first things that we should be considering, but I wanted to add as well that we are engaged not only in a business or a job, but also a profession. And from my perspective, looking at the survey results, looking through all the materials, I think that the integrated bar is the best way to support the profession of the practice of law, which is really maintaining the rule of law in our state and in our country. It's no question that access to justice and the rule of law is the underpinnings of our foundation. And I think that the integrated bar serves that the best, mostly because, as we see, it's going to be more expensive to bifurcate. The people who join the bifurcated bar for the services aren't necessarily the people who are going to need those services, but maintaining an integrated bar, we're then able to provide services to new lawyers or young lawyers or lawyers that don't have the money to belong to both bars. And it's going to improve their ability to practice law, which improves the ability of their clients to get the justice that they deserve. It improves the ability of the courts to adequately rule on cases before them because they're argued by both sides equally well with the information that's been provided and the services and help that the integrated bar has provided the lawyers. So I think there's both this very important practical aspect, but also this higher, almost moral calling that we have as lawyers to maintain the profession. And from my perspective, only the integrated bar is going to do that. Thanks.
Thank you, Governor Boyd. Governor Abell.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have a kind of a factual question for Jordan. I just want to make sure I understand correctly. So, Jordan, I thought I heard you say that the survey results that were sent out to the members had I think you said a 20% majority in favor of the status quo. And I might be misreading it, but I thought the results of the survey were 45% in favor of the status quo, 38% in favor of a bifurcated bar, and 3% in favor of some other alternative form. Am I looking at something different, or are we? I just want to make sure I'm not way out to lunch on that.
You're totally right. The difference between 38 and 44, whatever numbers were, or the 45, whatever the numbers were, is a 20% margin. So that's why I said it was a 20% margin, not by 20% actual in votes, but that's the margin there is higher, which is what you have to look at in these. To typical statistical analysis, you get the percentages, but you don't want to talk about just the actual percentage change because that doesn't tell you much because, a percentage change could be small, but it's a large margin if you have a lower vote total, right? So
I'm following you. So, okay. So I'll be talking about that a little bit, but point well taken. Thanks, Jordan.
Any other questions for Governors Boyd and Couch? Going once. Well, thank you very much to both of you for that. Oh, wait a minute. Governor Stevens has his hand up.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the presentation, governors. I have a question for you, but it's also a question that then I'll be asking Governor Abell to address later on. I think you mentioned that in the surveys, one area of dissatisfaction, if you will, for people who want to have bifurcation is in the area of DEI. And if I heard you correctly, and I heard that correctly, my understanding is that both as you propose it, meaning DEI is a germane activity, and as I read at least Governor Abell's proposal where DEI would be one of the activities that would remain in the regulatory bar. I'm just curious how I think your argument is bifurcation is not going to actually resolve not having DEI on the regulatory side. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's 2 points. My one point is that bifurcation isn't going to resolve the complaints. And in that also expressing that I think there's a lot of value in having all of us together unified, because that way the sections are behind DEI work as well, right? Like I remember when I was first in the solo small practice section and the young lawyers, every year we would have DEI training that we were required to go through as part of the executive committee, because we were part of this unified bar that mandated this and made us think about this and had focus on this. And so I think that is important. And I think a unified bar allows us to lead stronger in DEI work, because we can mandate it across the entire bar as unified programs, instead of having it be one part of the bar, but then this voluntary section doesn't have to address it at all. And so, yeah, it's partially that it won't resolve the complaints because DEI work would remain with the unified bar. And it's also that we can do better DEI work where we are unified, because that's the work that's important. And frankly, that's work that you see some of the lawsuits that happen in the States. People are upset about this. That's the thing people don't like, but that's all the more reason we need to be insisting on this work and mandating this work and working together to have it be as unified across the board. Every lawyer is touching on this regularly in their practice, because it is extremely important work. And the more people are reticent about it, kind of tells me how important it is.
Thank you.
We have our advancement director, Kevin Platchey, who's got his hand up.
Thank you, President Tollefson. Governor Stevens, I just wanted to add a little bit operationally about what Governor Couch is talking about. And the DEI team within the organization doesn't do its work in isolation. So that team works very heavily with the advancement department, particularly our CLE team, in pushing out the information about DEI. In fact, we offer 3 free DEI CLEs through the Legal Lunchbox that over 2,000 members participate in each session of those DEI programs. So just to give a little more flavor of how it works, that's really, there's a lot of collaboration within the organization. It's not just the DEI team doing that work. They're leveraging other parts of the organization to push the information out. Thank you.
Past President Schiketti.
I don't have a question. I just have an observation that adds on to what Governor Couch and Governor Boyd were talking about earlier. I anticipate that at some point we're going to talk about lack of participation in the survey as a reason for why we shouldn't give it much merit. But not only did the elder law section come up with a similar percentage of folks being in favor of maintaining the status quo. Also, that was the sentiment of the sections. Also, the sentiment of the survey, and almost exact numbers in favor again of keeping our current structure, but also of the staff as well, the staff survey. So on all 4 points, all 4 surveys, they all come out in favor of keeping our mandatory bar. And so then eventually we're going to talk about, well, the percentage of the membership that have responded. And we've talked about that before. We've talked about it in terms of the votes for governors and elections, and how we have a very low turnout. And some people attribute that to dissatisfaction with the WSBA. I don't. What I heard many times, both as a governor and as a president, was that, quite frankly, we trust our leadership. We trust what you guys are doing, and we don't need to pay attention to this. We don't need to necessarily get involved because we like what you're doing. If they don't trust us, we hear from them. We hear from them at BOG meetings. We hear from them at events. We hear from them at listening tours, and we hear from them when we're traveling around the state, meeting with them for coffee or in individual capacities. But when I was doing that, meeting around the state, which I found very, very informative with the listening tours, both during President Pickett's year, my year. President Majumdar unfortunately did not have too much of that. And then this year with President Tollefson, we would hear an occasional person saying that the fees were too high. But for the most part, everyone was very positive about what we were doing. And that says a lot about what our organization does and how it's operating. We've been doing this for almost 90 years as a mandatory bar. I can't count the number of times where I've been traveling around the country and I hear Washington State has done this and Washington State has, led the country in doing X, Y, and Z. We have done an excellent job. And while it's not perfect and we've had struggles along the way, we can't discount the fact that Washington State is a leader in this nation. And we did that through a mandatory bar. We did that together. And it would be my strong recommendation to all of you. I don't get a vote, but my recommendation to all of you is that the mandatory bar is better for all of us. It's cheaper for all of us. It will serve us well into the future. That's not to say that Governor Williams Couch's idea about the different entity is not one to be considered. I'm also intrigued by that. I think we need some more information about it, but it's something that we should consider, and perhaps in coordination with the mandatory bar. Thank you.
We have our Chief Communications Officer, Sarah Nagowski, who's got her hand up.
I just wanted to comment about the survey because a couple of people have gone back and forth. But what I do want to note, if you look in the memo, and I know it came late with apologies, the survey was specifically done to be a scientifically valid sample of the membership. And the survey company is actually really, really happy with the validity that came back and the confidence level. We beat their expectations. And so I want to make it clear, this didn't go out to everybody, and it was on purpose. An all opt-in survey tends to get very fringe results because the people who are motivated to take the survey have very particular interests. And so, the professional surveyors have a lot of confidence that the sample of our members is a good one. It is, if you look at the margin of error, it's 5%. I think it's actually under 5% when you look at it. But I just wanted to clear that up. This wasn't, we put it out to 40,000 and only this many responded. It was a very carefully selected number, randomly throughout the state. And our survey company is actually really confident with the sampling and the number of responses we got back. So I just wanted to clear that up as we were talking about the number and the confidence in the response rate.
Thank you, Chief Communications Officer Nagowski. Anybody else have any questions or comments for our presenters, Governor Couch and Governor Boyd, on the status quo proposal?
Mr. President.
Governor Stevens.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm now going to try to lower my.
You did it.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to. I'm certainly in the camp with Governor Couch and Governor Boyd, but I wanted to give a context about status quo. And first of all, I want to give a context about the idea of continuing what we're doing, which does not mean do nothing. And I think that's a pejorative. Because I think even in the context of the status quo, there is always work to be done to improve the services and the efforts that we make for our members and for the public. And so I just want to give clarity. I think Governor Couch pointed out very well that without having what I might call the sword of Damocles over our head, that we've got to do something. I still think this process has been very good, and I am still going to be looking for an alternative for the future if things go sideways. But that doesn't mean we don't continue to do the work that we do to improve our services and improve our responses to the members and to the public. As we look at the other options, and I think I made this clear to Governor Abell in, he asked me to comment on his proposal, and I gave him my comment. And what I basically said was that, yes, we leave things as they are, but we also do the best job we can to be at the ready on what our preferred alternatives were, or what our preferred alternative is. Should the issue come before us, we will at least have made the record about what the preferred alternative is. And so it is. I'm in the view of yes, we leave things as they are, but we also leave for the record what the next best option will be. And so I'm still wanting to hear from the other proposals. From my perspective, if I'm in the majority about continuing as we are, I still want to make sure we also have clearly set out what our preferred alternative is should the matter arise again. So thank you.
Thank you, Governor Stevens. Anybody else have their hand up? Yes, Governor Angelo.
Thank you, Mr. President. I really like what Governor Stevens said. The sentence "preserve the status quo" and or "do nothing" are two very different things. And frankly, I see us as being stewards of our mission. And in being stewards of that mission, we're always challenged to do better. We're always striving to do work that will live up to the directives of our mission or the directives of the court with respect to DEI. I really feel strongly that we will work to be a stronger association if we are unified. I also believe that having different voices within the association is actually a helpful thing because it helps us refine and continuously define how we're meeting the terms of our mission. But in doing that, I really do truly believe that standing together is the way that we have the most strength.
Thank you, Governor Angelo. Anybody else have their hands up? Well, so why don't we go ahead and have Governor Abell and anybody else that he's planning on having share the spotlight on his proposal. Ready to go, Governor Abell?
I am, yes. Thank you, Mr. President. So I'll just go ahead and get right into this. So I'd like to thank you, first of all, Mr. President, for the opportunity to speak on this proposed reform of the WSBA structure to adopt a voluntary and a mandatory model. A couple of other quick thanks. First of all, I want to thank Jordan and Lauren for their presentations. I kind of feel like it's a cross motion for summary judgment. The other side went first, and after the other side goes, I throw my hands in the air and think, well, they've convinced me. I've lost. But now, of course, there's an opportunity for me to review my notes, remember what I put before the court in the first place, and be reminded, no, this is why I think there's a better and a different result. So I'm going to go ahead and lay that out now. I also want to thank Governor Stevens. So earlier in this process, this ethos process, I think I had expressed, maybe some frustration and a lack of patience. And Governor Stevens had to remind me, Hunter, just because you went through this a few years ago with the bar structure task force by the Supreme Court, as did past President Schiketti and Governor President-elect Clark, the rest of us haven't. And that was a really good reminder to me. I've just tried to tuck that away in the back of my mind as we've been going through this process. I want to thank Governor Stevens for that reminder. And thank you, Mr. President, for how you have taken us through this process and brought us to this point. My last kind of preliminary comment is I would like to just reiterate what I hope is already clear, that my comments in favor of a reformed model for the WSBA, which would involve creating a voluntary and a mandatory entity, really come from a deep affection for this organization and an even deeper love for the profession. None of my comments should be interpreted in any way as throwing rocks at the organization, because it's not. I think quite simply that there is a better way to do the good and the important work that we've been doing to date. And I think the data supports that. All right, getting into the substantive remarks, as outlined on pages 8 through 30 of the late meeting materials, I do urge this board to recommend to the Supreme Court that we adopt a voluntary mandatory model, what some people call a bifurcated model, similar to that recently adopted by the State Bar of California. As a result, my answers to the Chief Justice's questions that were posed to us, questions 2 and 3, would be the same as outlined in my memo. At the conclusion of this presentation later today, I anticipate making a motion urging this board to adopt the answers as described. Even if the answer to question number 3, however, is declined by this board, and this board decides to adopt a status quo approach, I hope that the answer to number 2 will be as outlined in my memo. This is what I call the in case of emergency break glass option. And I think it's a good option for us because it's a proven model in the sense that California recently went through this process. They had some success, and I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel here. If we got into a position with number 2 where we had to make a change, there is an example of some sister states who've recently gone before us that have done this change that we can adopt and revise as necessary. All right, so talking more about the model, we're all familiar with the idea. It is, in effect, the primary alternative model to the current integrated structure. As outlined in my memo and the related template, it involves transitioning the regulatory functions under the more or less direct control of the Washington Supreme Court and transitions the voluntary professional trade associations to a new voluntary entity. A couple of quick comments regarding the proposal in my memo. In putting this together, and I think Sarah Nagowski might laugh when I say this, there is definitely a Goldilocks problem in presenting this information. What I mean by that is that too much information becomes overwhelming, and frankly, I think departs a little bit from what we can reasonably expect to be the decisions that are made down the road. Too little information, however, is just not helpful. And that's part of the challenge that we have here. So what I have elected to do is present a fairly detailed memo, which outlines one possible iteration of what could happen if this board adopts the high-level decision to adopt a voluntary mandatory model, or rather recommend a voluntary mandatory model to the state Supreme Court if the state Supreme Court concurred. Part of my reasoning with this is that I said I would put forward a detailed proposal. I mentioned that earlier in this ethos process. This was part of my effort to put my money where my mouth is and give something for people to look at and address. But all that being said, I'd encourage us not to get bogged down in the details and not say, I'm concerned that this entity under your proposal, Governor Abel, goes to this, the mandatory entity or the voluntary entity or whatever that might be, because ultimately, if we were to adopt this model and the Supreme Court were to adopt this model, then those decisions would require talking with stakeholders, some of whom are not in the room. All right, so with that being said, I think there are a multitude of reasons to support a reformed model. First and foremost, it decisively resolves the constitutional issues that are present with the current model. Now, even if the US Supreme Court ultimately upholds the integrated structure of the Bar Association at some point, it is undoubted that there are constitutional issues presented with the current model. Put simply, we engage in legislative activities and speak on behalf of all of our members in doing so. Some of our members, I would say many of our members, do not like the positions that we take. Therefore, even if we survive review, the constitutional issue remains real. One thing I would note is that the issues with the constitutional issues that are presented, I would argue, are heard more about from members the further we get from Puget Sound. The closer we are to downtown, I think there's less concern. But the further we get away, and especially over the Cascades, this is something that we hear about repeatedly from our members. Secondly, it decisively resolves the issue of the divided mission of this organization. And to be clear, I think we do our mission pretty well, but I think there is a better way to do it. As outlined in Exhibit B to my memo, the ABA Journal article, there is a, quote, distracted regulator challenge to the current model. California addressed that by adopting a voluntary, mandatory model, such as what I've outlined here. And reforming has resulted in increased mission focus, both for the regulators in the mandatory entity, as well as increased mission focus on competing for members and giving them value for their dollars within the voluntary entity. Those are good results. Those are results that we should strive for. Another reason why this is the appropriate action to take is that this is a clear trend. It is notable that no one is advocating to go in the opposite direction. There is no movement among states that have a voluntary mandatory model to say, you know what, we should really go with an integrated model. That's simply not made. And the reason for that is clear. We have increased mission focus and we address the constitutional issues with the model that I'm advocating for. The other point is that the increased competition for members that the voluntary model would have is a laudable thing. Governor Couch argued that it would be a drawback and that it would necessarily be pandering to members, but I don't think that's the case. I think instead that competition is a healthy dynamic and result in a strong and fiscally responsible organization. Now let me talk about some of the arguments in opposition. I think it's first and foremost interesting the argument that has not been made, and to my knowledge never has been made. I've never heard anyone argue that moving to a voluntary mandatory model would somehow hurt our regulatory functions. I think that's important. And I think it's also important to point out that I don't think that is an argument that is really colorable. Instead, I think it's clear that the opposite is true. Adopting this revised model would increase the mission focus of our core regulatory functions. And to be clear, this is really the crown jewels of what we do. This is really important, the regulatory functions. And I think what we should, the decisions we make need to be taken with an eye toward improving and strengthening those functions. Arguments in opposition include, we want to have the strength of speaking with one voice through the WSBA. This is what I call the "we are stronger together" argument. I'm sympathetic to that argument, and it's rhetorically powerful, but it is only rhetoric. What I mean by that is the fact that we are stronger together is only a result of the fact that we are all together by fiat. We are together because we have to be. This results in the constitutional issues that I described before, as well as the distracted mission. The case law shows us that we can have a politically active bar association or an integrated bar association, but I don't believe we can have both. This is a problem of us wanting to be able to, rather some of us wanting to be able to engage in legislative activities, speaking on behalf of all of the members while retaining the integrated structure. And I think that's a fundamental flaw with the current model. Another argument is that an entity or an activity that's important to me will be hurt. Now, I think I've told the story to the board before about how I served previously on the Professionalism Committee, which was a wonderful organization. That committee, unfortunately, was sunsetted many years ago with very little input involving the committee, and it resulted in a loss, unfortunately, for the committee and for the overall organization. It is possible that in a reform, a preferred entity or a valuable entity or activity could be impacted. That's true with any reform. But I think it's important to be clear that if the entity or the activity is worthy, value added, and cost effective, I think it's likely it's going to continue to be supported either under the mandatory or the voluntary entities. Another argument that we've heard today is the members don't want it. I don't think that's true. As was discussed before, the survey results that we see with a limited sample is 45% to 38% in favor of keeping the current model, with that 38% specifically being in favor of a bifurcated model, and an additional 3% preferring a different structure altogether. In other words, it's 45% to 41%, with that 41% representing something different. That survey has a 5% margin of error. This is darn near a statistical tie. I think that's extraordinary. And it comes at a time when I think we're doing pretty well. This organization has been on, I would argue, on a roll lately and doing well in helping lead this profession. We've avoided a lot of the very nasty headlines that we saw a few years ago. Just imagine what the survey results would have been a couple of years ago. Since this is election season, I would say that this is the type of survey results that would immediately result in 1 million emails going out saying, we are within striking distance, donate today. So I take a very different conclusion out of these survey results. And again, my observation is that the further away we get from downtown, the bigger that number grows in favor of an alternative structure. Another argument that's been thrown out, we don't know what it will cost. And this was the question that was outlined by Governor Purser. I will say to this, that's correct. We don't exactly know what it will cost. We have a fiscal analysis prepared by our wonderful staff that is necessarily imprecise. The staff did a great job of taking a look at my model, my memo, and trying to figure out what it would cost. And what we see, in my mind, is not surprising. What we would see is that the fee for the voluntary entity would likely go down, the fee for the mandatory entity would likely go down. There would, however, be a separate fee for a voluntary entity. If we take those fees together, it would cost more than what the current fee is just for this organization. I don't think any of those results are a surprise. But I do say that the precise fiscal impact will depend on those decisions that would be made later on in this process if this board were to adopt or recommend to the Supreme Court that we adopt a revised voluntary mandatory model. Another argument that we have heard, diversity will be hurt. As was noted by the King County Bar Association letter in response to the Washington Supreme Court task force 2 years ago, that is not correct. Under their perspective, and I think it's correct, DEI efforts will be better served under a bifurcated model under the direct control of the state Supreme Court. I want to say as a practical matter, I think it's likely that our court will be strongly protective of DEI efforts if they come under their direct control. So I do not believe that diversity would be hurt in any way, or rather DEI efforts would be hurt in any way by adopting this model. The last one I would describe as the general, I'm afraid concern. I care about the bar. I care about the profession. I'm afraid for the future. And this is what I call a defense of the familiar. And this is in some ways the argument that I have the most sympathy for because it resonates a lot with me. I also defend the familiar. This organization has been around in its current structure for a long time, but at the same time, that's not a reason to keep it forever. Our current structure is, I would call it clunky, expensive, slow moving, and clearly not the trend. I think it's notable that states as different as California and Nebraska have come to the same conclusion, that there is a better structure for their bar association. And I think we can come to the same conclusion. So with all that being said, I would encourage this board to recommend to the Supreme Court a positive forward-looking vision for reform of the WSBA and its functions. One last note, I would also encourage this board, if we were to recommend to the court that we go down this path, we also recommend an advisory vote of the members, which I think will be more concrete and helpful than the survey results we have today. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm happy to address any questions or concerns that the board may have.
Thanks, Governor Bell. Anybody have any questions, comments they would like to address to Governor Bell? Governor, President-elect Clark.
Do you want me to read your comment?
Sure, please.
Yes, please.
Okay, a few questions for Governor Abell. If the BOG did vote to bifurcate, what happens with WSBA's current assets? What about our current lease that runs through December 2026? Do both proposed entities just stay at WSBA's current location? What about current contracts and financial obligations? Finally, what and how would current financial assets be divided between the regulatory functions and the new volunteer optional entity? Would the Supreme Court just determine who gets what?
All right, thank you, President-elect Clark. A series of really good questions, and I think I've got some partial answers to some of them, and some of them I think would require additional consultation with, again, stakeholders, including the court, as well as stakeholders involving the various entities involved. Regarding the question about the current assets in the lease, I do believe that depends on the division and the allocation of the various entities as to whether or not they go to the mandatory entity or to the voluntary entity. As to whether or not both entities would just stay at the WSPA's current location, I think in large part that would depend on what the court wants to do. You know, one of the other iterations of the model that I've heard is that if we were to adopt this voluntary mandatory reform, is that the regulatory functions would go over to the court under the auspices of the administrative office of the courts. That's a possibility. There may be some intermediary entity. Now, my memo advised that, or recommended, that the regulatory functions be under the direct purview of the Supreme Court with an intermediary board of advisors. Some have argued that maybe it should be this board of governors. Maybe this board of governors should survive and go over and be an intermediary organization. But I think all those questions will require getting answers and direction from the court about what they would want. I think that will help inform us as to the question of whether we stay or go. And then I think in response to the last question, how would the current financial assets be divided? I would fall back on my initial answer. I believe that does depend on the ultimate allocation of the entities and the activities as to whether or not they go to the mandatory or the voluntary association. Thank you.
I see Nancy Hawkins has her hand up, followed by Governor Couch.
Thank you. I have one quick question. Tried to put it in the chat, but for some reason my chat wasn't working. Hunter, could you please identify several specific issues that Eastern Washington has specifically objected to with regard to section activities or legislative action in the past 2 years? And if you could identify your source for that belief.
Yeah, so I would say in the past 2 years, I have not been provided specific examples of activities that we have taken as the sections or the WSBA that are of specific concern. And I think that actually that goes to my point. We've been on pretty good behavior lately. I think the problem is that, as was discussed in previous meetings, we don't come to this with a blank slate. We come to this with a history. In addition, one of the ongoing perennial criticisms or concerns that exist with this organization is that it is too Seattle-centric with its downtown headquarters. The overall approach taken by this organization seems to have a very strong Seattle bias, and that does continue. And so I think that's something that is heard and amplified the further we get from Seattle. But in specific response to your question, no, I think the last 2 years, I'm pretty pleased with how this board has behaved.
So if I could just add.
Yes, please.
If 2 years is too short a time, could you do so for the last 5 years, as well as identify then a couple of issues that you think reflect a Seattle-centric leaning that is problematic for Eastern Washington?
Yeah, sure. So, the items that I frequently hear about in Eastern Washington are related both to the decisions of this board about marriage, as well as marijuana, are the two items that I hear about going back in time. The items with regard to being too Seattle-centric are with regard to our location and a willingness or an ability to. Those are some of the primary things that I hear.
I'm sorry, your audio cut out at that last sentence.
Can you repeat that? Part of your answer got cut out.
Yeah, sure. I would say it's the location of the WSBA headquarters and the ability of, individuals in Eastern or Central Washington or out on the peninsula to meaningfully participate.
Any other follow-up, Nancy Hawkins?
So does that mean that your proposal is dependent upon the office moving out of Seattle?
No, not at all. I'm saying that this is one of the items that would be addressed by the proposal. For example, I think it would be fascinating to find out where the voluntary organization, if it were created, elected to establish its headquarters. It might be that it decides to have a very legislatively active presence and has a headquarters down in Olympia. It might be that it decides that it wants to compete more effectively for members throughout the state and has its headquarters in, Tacoma or Ellensburg or Spokane. I don't know the answer to that, but I would be interested to see what the answer is.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we've got Governor Couch followed by Governor Boyd.
So Governor Ebel, I noticed in your fiscal analysis, you estimated for the Voluntary Bar Association 15,000 members, and that was what your costs were based on. But right now our section membership is just over $10,000, and the data we have indicates that membership would actually be less than that, even if we offered it for free, and that would be, struggling as they are in California to keep up that. So I'm curious where that number of 15,000 came from in the fiscal analysis, and if we have to actually estimate that the fees would be much higher because we probably would have no more than 2/3 of that number.
So this is where I will enthusiastically defer to staff. I fortunately for all of us did not do the fiscal analysis. We would end up with math that makes no sense. So I will defer to staff who very capably performed the fiscal analysis.
And I see Director Platchey has his hand up. He can speak to that.
Well, maybe we should have Director Platchey answer that right away before we get to the next question.
Sure. Thank you, President Tollefson. And so I'll just give some high-level overview of the fiscal analysis, which was done by myself and Maggie Yu, our controller. The assumptions were conservative. The 15,000 is was taken based on sort of the number of section memberships we have. But I did note that I think in the initial analysis, I did note that's a conservative number, particularly after we heard from California's experience where they actually lost 10,000 section members when they converted to the voluntary association. Yes, I think the number is optimistic, but that's what we used just when we were doing the initial analysis based on the number of section members we have. Would it play out that way? If it played out like it did in California, no, it wouldn't.
And if I may make just a brief observation regarding the likely loss of members for a voluntary organization, there's two parts to that, right? On one hand, because we're within this association, we care about it, we think, gosh, that's a bad result. On the other hand, I think we also need to think about that these are members of our organization, or actually members of the profession, who are freely electing to put their time, their treasure, and their talents towards something different. And it might be toward other voluntary bar associations like the County Bar Association or MBAs. It might be their places of worship. It might be service organizations, whatever it might be. And so I don't think that's necessarily a bad result. And I think it would be very interesting to see how a voluntary organization would compete to keep for those members. Thank you.
And just if I can ask a quick follow-up on that. Just for clarity then, the number was based on section memberships, not members who are a member of a section, because some members have multiple sections, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so any more questions, Governor Couch? Nope. Governor Boyd.
Thank you, President Tollefson. Governor Abel, I'm curious about your comment that the mandatory portion of the fees would go down. California's went up. And so I'm skeptical of a comment that ours would necessarily go down. My understanding is California's went from 430 total for their integrated bar to the regulatory function was just 515 alone. And then if you wanted to be a member of the voluntary bar, you have to pay on top of that. So that I have a couple of questions, but that's my first one is where does your numbers or ideas that then the still mandatory portion of the bar dues would go down?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that comes from the fiscal analysis that was included in the late materials. That projects that the fee for the mandatory organization would go down to about $364. Now, there's necessarily guesswork with this. Again, our staff has done great work in putting this together. But a lot of this will depend on how the various entities and activities are ultimately allocated. And as I understand it, they prepared the fiscal analysis based on the memo that I outlined with the various entities going under the mandatory organization versus the voluntary organization. But that number could change. I think you've raised a very interesting point about how in California, the licensing fee went up after they adopted this model. I've never really received a satisfactory explanation for as to why, but the fiscal analysis of the model that I have proposed indicates a declining or a reduced fee. And there's staff hands up all over the place. We might want to hear from them.
Yeah, there's a lot of hands.
Thank you.
I don't know if these are questions. I don't know if these are questions or if these are provide information type things. So I'm going to go with the people. I'm just going to go on the 1, 2, 3, which is got Executive Director Nevitt, followed by Director of Advancement Platchy, followed by Chief Disciplinary Counsel Indy.
Thank you. I wanted to give information. I just want to speak a little bit to sort of our the approach we took, the overall approach, which was, as Governor Abel has said, there's so much guesswork here, and we really wanted to be careful that we were not influencing the decision through the fiscal analysis. So we really tried to be sort of as conservative and as reasonable as possible. I think, once these organizations were to split off, any number of things could happen. And, one thing I could imagine happening is, we've talked about staff capacity, staff needs, the regulatory entity or the voluntary entity might determine that they need more resources to adequately pursue their mission. And so I think that is where you might see the fee go up. However, we didn't account for that because that felt like too much guesswork. And so instead, we simply took the cost of our existing staff, our existing capacity, and then we tried to estimate for those number of people, what would be required in terms of administrative support, so human resources and finance and that sort of thing. So that's really what those numbers represent, is our existing capacity. But once those two organizations were to go off on their own, they may wish to increase capacity or shrink capacity. And we didn't feel like we could hazard a guess at what that might be without looking like we were really trying to influence the numbers one way or the other.
Director Platchy.
She had quite a night.
Thank you, President Tollefson. I just wanted to provide a little more context into the fiscal analysis, primarily because when we did the fiscal analysis initially, and when the presentation was given a couple meetings ago on all of the scenarios, we did go over two. One was the California model. We just took that and said, what would it look like if we went the way of California? And if we went the way of California, and that's where Governor Abel is correct, all of this is going to depend on how the court or whoever the ultimate decision maker is would split this up if bifurcation is the way it goes. But if you go the way of California, even here, the license fee would go up if you went the way of California, because all California did was bifurcate out sections and CLE. That's what they did. And the problem with that here and in California, which is what the executive director there told us, is CLE and sections operate out of separate funds from the general fund. And they pay back a lot of overhead to the organization. And in fact, for our organization, that's about $500,000 that the sections and CLE pay in overhead towards the organization. So if you bifurcate them out and only them, you lose the $500,000 contribution to overhead from those two operations.
Exactly what I've been saying.
So, so that's one thing with the California model. Now, with the regulatory model that Governor Abell, that we did the fiscal analysis on with Governor Abell's proposal, yes, under that proposal, if you move more than sections and CLE out, if you start moving other things out, then the cost will go down. The license fee under that model, and again, as Executive Director Nevitt said, these aren't to the penny, right? They're ballpark analysis based on what we know now. Then under that model, the license fee itself would go down to about $364, and it's around $485 now or something like that, or $450 something. But the other part of that analysis is that's just the licensing regulatory operation. You have to take into account now what's happening with a voluntary organization. And what we found is just based on the numbers, the 15,000 membership numbers, which could be high or not.
Hello.
Is
how's your work going?
With the
Hey, just a minute.
Hey Nancy, you're not muted.
Somebody's
I just muted them. We should be okay.
Okay, thank you.
So if you take just then you got to look at the voluntary model. So the voluntary model, it's another 300 and I don't have it right in front of me. I should, but it's another, it comes out if somebody wanted to have the voluntary or belong to the voluntary organization and the licensing organization, it would cost them around $703 total. So if they wanted to sort of apples to apples, if they wanted to get what they're getting now and belong to both, it's going to cost them $703 versus the integrated fee now. And of course, again, that's an estimate. But you're right, if someone only wants to belong to the regulatory organization, it would be cheaper for them.
Okay,
Can I ask?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, can I ask
Governor
Director
Boyd,
Flatley? Thank
yes,
you.
please.
Thank you. Since Director Flatley has the numbers, do you know, Director, whether the California licensing mandatory fee, is that fully funded, or that, I guess, the licensing and regulating activities, is that fully funded by the fees, or California taxpayers, non-lawyers, subsidizing some of that?
Well, I don't know that answer for sure. I don't know if somebody knows it better than me, but my understanding is they're self-operating off of the license fee, that they're still doing that. I think the legislature has some kind of involvement since they split, but I'm not sure to the extent of what it is. I don't think they're funding it. I think they do have some involvement in appointing board members and that kind of thing, something like that. I'm not really 100% sure.
Okay, thank you. President, I didn't know if anybody else had their hands up about the
We have a whole
funding piece of it, but I did have a couple other questions if it's my turn again.
well, okay, but I don't know if any I think Chief Disciplinary Counsel Andy might have his hand up for the funding issue, or yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, President Tollefson. I don't know how many of you follow the politics of regulation in the state of California. I do, and I have for a long time. And I think it's an oversimplification to say that the licensing fee went up in the State Bar of California only because of their quasi bifurcation. I don't disagree with Kevin's explanation of their staff analysis. Obviously, it had an effect, But there were bigger issues in California and have been for a long time. There is substantial concern about the funding and efficacy of California's regulatory efforts. If you read the news in California, you'll get a sense of what's going on there. They were underfunded. They needed to raise that licensing fee in order to get their discipline system under control so it could be effective. I don't know that the same concerns that led to legislative investigation of the efficacy of California's regulatory systems exist in Washington, and I hope they do not. But I don't think we can analogize directly from what happened in California, which is a vastly different system. The legislature approves their budget. The legislature approves the appointment of their leadership. I don't think we can analogize from California to what would likely happen in the state of Washington. Finally, I have some general comments related to the issue that I can reserve for when my turn comes around again.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Governor Boyd, you got more questions for our presenter, right?
Yes, thank you. I guess just one overarching is I still haven't seen, and I'm wondering if you can, I don't know if speculate is the right word, but provide some examples for, I think one of the big benefits that I see for an integrated bar association is that we have to do less disciplining and regulating, I would assume, because we're providing services on the front end that are making lawyers better and more effective and less likely to create issues that are going to cause them to have to be disciplined. So one of my biggest concerns with breaking the bar up is that it will result in fewer people joining the voluntary bar associations, getting the services that they need, and then more disciplinary actions because of that. So I'm wondering if you can speak to safe measures that your plan, Governor Abel, would put in place to ensure that lawyers are getting the help that they need on the front end. I kind of analogize it to our healthcare system, which I've heard people complain that we treat the symptoms after someone has developed a disease, but what we should be doing is treating someone or giving them healthy ways to live beforehand so that they never develop a disease. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a really good question, and I don't pretend to have all the answers. I will say, again, what I tried to do was in my memo have a fairly robust explanation of what would go where. For my purposes, or what I recommended was that we have things like the ethics line and the Council of Professional Ethics or the Committee on Professional Ethics remain with the mandatory entity. I think both those are strengthened by their proximity to the court, and that would help address some of the questions that or the concerns that you've addressed. But I think it's a great question. I've tried to plant my flag in my memo to say how I would address it, but a lot will depend on further direction and discussions with the court and other stakeholders.
Governor Boyd, did you have another question?
No, thank you. I might raise my hand again in the future, but for now I'm good.
Thank you very much. Governor Stevens, followed by Governor Pertzer.
Thank you, Mr. President. Governor Abel, I enjoyed your going through your posited questions and then answering those. Of course, they were as you described those questions, but I have one that I don't think you dealt with that I want to hear more from you about. And that is that, as I had mentioned earlier, when I reviewed your proposal, DEI would remain on the regulatory side of the house. And I'd like you to address that element and address how your proposal would deal with some of our members' dissatisfaction or disagreement with DEI, period, and it's still being in the regulatory side.
Yeah, thank you, Governor Stevens. I guess a couple of observations. First of all, the court has told us that DEI is important. I suspect that if we recommended to the court that we adopt this voluntary mandatory model, as a practical matter, I think the court is going to say, we're going to take this. This is of sufficient importance to us that we're going to take this under the mandatory entity. So that's one piece. Something else I think is that DEI, although it can, some of our members don't like it. I think, for example, the Texas case shows us that it's germane, right? And that that's one of the dynamics that we have here. So my strong sense is that DEI can and should go under the mandatory model, and that the effect of that for the members who don't like it is that, frankly, if they don't like it, they can register their dissatisfaction at the ballot box with the state Supreme Court. I mean, they have the right of every other voter to express concerns or dislike of what actions are taken as a result of that. But my sense is that the court believes it's important. The court would want to take this on. And if we were to go down this route, that's the appropriate destination of our various DEI efforts.
Governor, just your last point, I was really curious when you began talking about the ballot box. And I'm curious, I want you to say more about that, since I didn't think we were generally in this place that people could express their opinions by a ballot measure, especially if it's not changing the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just trying to understand how this ballot box option actually works as it relates to petitioning the court or I guess what, directing the court? Please say more.
Yeah, so what I was thinking was that people can vote in favor or against candidates for the state Supreme Court based on any number of different variables, right? It might be based on how that Supreme Court justice voted in a case. It might be based on how their perceptions about how that state Supreme Court justice is helping regulate the profession of law. It could be on any number of different things. But, if a member doesn't like what's happening in the regulatory functions under the direct control of the state Supreme Court, then that member can register their dissatisfaction at the ballot box. That was my thought.
Okay. Yeah, the election of members of the court.
Right. Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Oh,
Any
one other thing.
There we go. Go ahead, please.
I'm sorry. Mr. President, I'm sorry, a follow-up?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. And Governor Abell, one of the other things that you mentioned, you were talking about the dissatisfaction. So I want to tease out, this idea of where the Bar Association is located, or where it's located, where the regulatory function would be located. You pose this argument, so I got to ask you. So, and you're in Perry County, and of course, other people are on the other side of the mountain. So, riddle me how that is no longer an issue if you moved the bar, the regulatory piece, to Olympia, how that then addresses whatever the complaints are about going to Seattle, and riddle me how if another idea, and I want you to, since you made the argument, I want you to get into the details. Are we talking about satellite offices? And if we are, then we are talking about increased costs, given that you make this argument about people not wanting to be in Seattle.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to give you an answer. It's only partially satisfactory because I don't pretend to speak on behalf of everyone who has raised this concern. I think we all know that a kind of a perennial criticism of this organization is that it is viewed as being too Seattle centric. Part of that is based on our headquarters, right? That's something that we hear repeatedly in response to member surveys or the road trips or whatever it might be. So that's part of it. You know, for me personally, I think if again, going several, decision points down the line, but if we were to recommend to the court that we adopt this mandatory voluntary model, and if the court were to agree, and if the decision were made to have the regulatory functions come under the direct purview of the court and move that down to Olympia, to me, that kind of makes sense. I mean, Olympia is our state capital. You know, to the extent that people have questions or concerns about that, there's an easy answer for that. It's a little bit the flip side of the coin about the argument that we hear with regard to Seattle. Seattle's where most of our members are, right? And so there is, I think, a quick, easy response of why the regulatory functions might go down to Olympia. Again, a lot of mights here, a lot of decision trees to go, and kind of follow along.
Governor Stevens, any other follow-up questions?
Yes, I did. And so you answered half. I'm asking the other half because, when we talk about costs, so again, I'm really pressing you on, the idea of people from outside of Seattle, but I'm asking you, and I know with all things, devil is in the details, but if we go down the path of having satellite offices, would that increase the costs? And are you saying, but that's not something you're proposing or suggesting as a response to Seattle?
Well, I guess, so I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. When you talk about we having satellite offices, are you talking about if this proposal were adopted? Are you talking about for the mandatory entity or the voluntary entity?
Yes, I'm talking about the mandatory end.
Yeah. Frankly, I'm a little more intrigued about what would happen on the voluntary side if the voluntary side decides that they are better able to compete for members and membership dues by having satellite offices. But setting that aside for the moment, on the mandatory side, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, there's so many decisions that would have to be made as far as what the court wants to do, what functions the court is taking on, and how the court believes it can most effectively ensure that the core regulatory functions are being carried out. But to me, I think it makes some intuitive sense if we're moving them directly under the court to have them down in Olympia. That's just me.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I know a lot of people have their hands up. We've been going since 9 and it's now 11. I'm wondering if it's okay if we all take about a 10-minute break and reconvene. The question order that I've got right now is Governor Pertzer, followed by Chair Cherry of the Practice of Law Board, followed by Past President Schicchetti, followed by Chief Disciplinary Counsel ND, followed by Nancy Hawkins. So you can all just kind of hold on for 10 minutes. We'll see you all back here in 10 minutes.